Welcome everybody to today's Health and Wellbeing Board meeting on the 8th of February 2022. My name is Paulette Hamilton and I am the Cabinet Member for Adult Social Care and Health, and I'll be chairing this meeting only until item 6, until item 7. Then unfortunately I will have to go, and then Will take over from me, the Vice Chair. So I do want to start, before I do anything, with introductions, and then I'll do the let me do this bit first. I apologise. Can I start by saying notice of recording that this meeting will be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast via the council meeting YouTube site, and that members of the press or public may record and take photographs except where there are confidential or exempt items. Can I ask those that are wishing to speak to indicate if you're on the screen in the chat box and the chat function, and Justin to my left, he will tell me so that I'll ensure that you get to speak, or by raising your hand if you're in the room. Can I ask you, if you're not speaking, to switch off your mic and video, it says here, when you're not speaking. Declarations, item 2, declarations of interest. Members are reminded that they must declare all relevant pecuniary or non-pecuniary interests arising from any business to be discussed at this meeting. And if it's a disclosable pecuniary interest, it needs to be declared. And the member must not speak, or persons attending this meeting speak or take part in that agenda item. Any declarations will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Has anybody got any declarations of interest? I take the silence that there are no declarations of interest. Apologies today, item 3, apologies. We have apologies from Councillor Sharon Thompson, also Richard Kirby, Doug Simkis, Sue Harrison, and Professor Graham Best. But Michael Walsh will be acting as a substitute. Now, before we go any further, could we just do some introductions? I've not been to this type of meeting for a while. So I'm going to start with myself and then go to Will. I'm Paulette Hamilton, and as I said earlier, Cabinet Member for Adult Social Care and Health, and I am in Birmingham City Council. To my right?
So I'm Will Taylor, I'm a local GP and the Chair of Birmingham Solihull CCG.
I'm Stephen Raymond, I'm Programmes Director for BBSC.
Hi, I'm Karen Halliwell, Interim Accountable Officer for BC.
I'm Carly James, Chief Executive for Isolation.
Hello, Mike Walsh, Head of Service for Christian in Adult Social Care with Birmingham City Council.
Pete Richmond, Chief Executive for Village Trust, but here from Birmingham Social Housing Partnership.
My name is Richard North. I'm a Chief Superintendent from West Midlands Police, and I'm the new Commander at Birmingham West, replacing Steve Gray.
Councillor Matt Bennett, Shadow Cabinet Member for Health and Wellbeing.
Director of Strategy and Point Development from the University Hospitals Birmingham. And I'm Dr. Manning, Director of the Health Birmingham City Council.
Now, online, we've got PA. Who is PA?
Hi, I'm Paul Athley. I'm Chief Finance Officer at Birmingham Solihull CCG, here for the first item on the agenda only.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. Who is AC? Because I can't see your name. I haven't got a...
Hi there, it's Andy Cave, Chief Executive of Health Watch Birmingham. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person today.
That's brilliant, Andy. You're here in spirit. And who is ME?
That's Michelle over today.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, we will move swiftly on. On here, I've got the dates of meeting. To note, the dates of meetings for the board for the municipal year. The next meeting will be on the 22nd of March 2022, and all meetings will commence at 1500 hours unless stated otherwise. Now, can we move to the exempt information, possible exclusion of the press and public? And can I just say at this point, in light of the reports that are going to be identified, exempt item number 6 and exempt item number 7 from appendix 1 or 2, we will go offline for this, won't we? So are we going to go offline now, just so that I'm clear?
Yes, or can you confirm?
So-
Michelle's not
Has it started? Right, can I at this point, right, can I at this point, I'm going to have to leave unfortunately, but can I welcome Will into the chair and he'll be taking over the meeting. And I'd just like to thank everybody for allowing me to come, do the little bit at the front, at the beginning of the meeting, and then to leave again. So I will see you all again soon, but will be finishing the meeting. Thank you very much, my pleasure. Okay.
Okay, so we shall move on to the action log. I think Shiraz Chair is going to take us there. That's nice. No action, that's nice and easy. Move on. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of a brief chair, because actually I think we've done an awful lot in here already. But it's our first meeting of the new year, and I think as we just had a discussion actually in the private section, there's a lot of looking back over the last couple of years about what's gone on, but a huge amount of looking forward to the future. I noticed that Sajid Javid stood up in Parliament today and announced the NHS plan to tackle some of the backlog we're seeing in the NHS. And one of the things that we're going to see through this agenda is really what we're going to do into the future as a system, whether it's how we're going to work at place and as an ICS, really bringing health and social care together. And bringing it more local to the people. So actually making decisions as close to the people as we possibly can about their health, their well-being, and those wider determinants of health that we talked about earlier. I think it's quite exciting times actually. That I'm really looking forward to Anna and Karen's presentation. Alongside that, we're actually going to be looking at our own plans for tackling the backlog and actually getting on top of some of the legacy effects of COVID. So really looking forward to how we do that. And again, also looking forward to the outputs of Commonwealth Games and actually the legacy that will bring, which is vitally exciting for Birmingham and Solihull, and I think the whole surrounding area as well, because it will have a legacy effect that could heavily impact some of those items we discussed earlier around the whole health of the area and wider determinants. So some really interesting things looking forward on the agenda. So I think we shall move on and try and get into it really. But first port of call is there's no public questions, and then just to get on to our current status around coronavirus. It's just.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously there's a fuller briefing on the COVID pandemic through the local outbreak engagement board. So I'll just highlight the key points of where we are at the moment. So we are seeing case numbers coming down. Testing rates have fallen slightly, but we are also monitoring COVID cases in wastewater, which allows us to keep an eye on what's going on if people aren't doing the tests. And the good news is it's coming down in our wastewater as well as in our testing. So that gives us some confidence in the pattern and the direction of travel. There remains a significant pressure within our NHS system in terms of COVID patients, but we're seeing clear evidence that the vaccine does what it says on the tin in terms of reducing the risk of death and the risk of requiring oxygen and intensive care support. And that is really validated nationally as well as locally. We're seeing quite a shift from the pattern we saw in terms of pressures on the NHS in the previous waves. Omicron is by far the dominant variant across Birmingham. We are now seeing some subsets of Omicron emerging. But the good news is the vaccine still is holding its defence in terms of death and severe illness. And every time a new variant appears across the world, there is an international effort to look at what the impact is on vaccinations, because across the world, we're using the same group of vaccines pretty much across the whole world. Until the rate of vaccination improves across the whole world, we will continue to see variants appear. And that will mean that we are now moving into a phase of living with COVID. COVID is not going to disappear in the short term, and adapting our society and our way of being to managing, navigating what is still a serious illness for people who are unvaccinated and can still be pretty unpleasant for people who are vaccinated. And I know several colleagues have had Omicron recently, and can testimony to the fact that it's not particularly nice condition to have. And in some senses, more people are reporting with Omicron finding it quite a rough experience than they did with the original Alpha strain, where more people had it without necessarily having symptoms. The other thing that I think is important to stress is Omicron is much better at reinfecting people. So we are seeing clear evidence of people who had Alpha or Delta strains who in December and then caught Omicron in January. The nature of the Omicron variant is that it bypasses our defence that we've learned through natural immunity from previous strains. The good news is when you have Omicron, it does seem to protect you against Delta and Alpha. So what we're not seeing is it happening the other way, which in some sense gives us some hope that if we see more variants of Omicron, new variants appear, Omicron protection from natural immunity plus or vaccination protection is likely to be pretty strong. The other thing that I thought was useful just to share with the board as part of the update was to put a little bit of numbers behind some of the differences that we're seeing. And there are two things I wanted to highlight to the board. One was the post-COVID syndrome, so long COVID, and we are seeing more information about this now. The estimates from the ONS survey and the Department of Health data is about 7.5% of confirmed cases of COVID still have symptoms 12 weeks after infection that are limiting their activities. So 12 weeks after their initial infection, they've still got enough symptoms that they're struggling to do day-to-day things, like dressing yourself, going to the shops, being able to hold a conversation, being able to go to work. So if you think about the number of people who've had COVID, that is a significant burden. And the NHS is working hard on COVID pathways, but also we're still learning about this. It is a new disease and a new set of syndromes. But what we are also seeing from the international evidence is that vaccination reduces your risk of developing long COVID, and that's true at any age. One of the things that's interesting about long COVID is it isn't particularly age specific. So unlike severe illness with COVID, where there is a definite age bias, so the older you are, the more likely you are to become sicker, with long COVID, we don't see the same age distribution. And we are certainly seeing 20 and 30-year-olds with quite severe symptoms. I know Will, you've shared some of that at previous boards. So vaccination does reduce the risk of long COVID. And if you do develop long COVID and you are vaccinated, your symptoms of your long COVID are less severe. So there's something going on with long COVID which probably links into our immune system that we don't yet fully understand, because that would kind of explain why vaccination is beneficial, where it isn't normally for many other conditions. The other thing that I thought was important to mention was just to put some numbers behind the evidence of the impact of vaccine on hospitalisation and death. And this is from a report that was published in late January from the UK HSA. And what that shows is that your risk of death, within 28 days of a positive test from COVID, if you're aged 30 to 39, is relatively small. It's 1.3 per 100,000 people infected. That's if you're unvaccinated. However, if you're vaccinated, it falls to 0.4. So there's a big drop-off, even at a younger age, in terms of the protection. If we look at older age groups, the difference between being unvaccinated and vaccinated, the 70 to 79-year-olds, is the difference between 81 people dying in 100,000 in the unvaccinated population and 10 in the vaccinated population. So now we're starting to see some really concrete numbers coming through about the evidence of the impact of vaccination on protecting people. We know with Omicron that the booster becomes more important, but what we are seeing from the early data from Omicron is that with the booster, you have an 89% reduction in hospitalisation. So really, really big numbers, and therefore it's really important to keep supporting people to get the vaccine, to answer their questions, and to respond to their concerns. And we are seeing improvement across the vaccination programme. We were visited earlier today by a member of NHS England's national team to review what we've been doing. And she was very impressed and really very much feedback of, you are doing everything, everything everywhere all the time in a truly global city. The challenge is we are a big system and a big city. And it's important to remember we have already vaccinated over 2 million people across the Birmingham Solihull system, which is a huge, huge success. So I hope that's a reasonable summary of where we are. As I said, there'll be more details in the local outbreak engagement.
Thank you, Justin. I mean, so some really positive things there, but also really highlighting the importance of vaccination and continuing to get vaccination. So, any questions on that? Anyone want to talk about? No? Thank you, Justin. Just what do you think the future of vaccination is?
So I suspect that one, that we will see another wave in the autumn winter, driven by variants from across the world. If we look at the 1918 flu pandemic, there were 5 waves before it really burnt itself out. We've had 4 of COVID so far. So if we follow that model, and it makes sense in a sense that the majority of the world, particularly in the southern hemisphere, is not yet vaccinated. And COVID is to some extent seasonal. It's not as seasonal as flu. So I would expect to see a new variant appearing in the southern hemisphere as they come through winter, and that's starting to move into the northern hemisphere over the autumn. By that time, we will have been able to adjust the vaccine. So I would strongly suspect there will be an annual vaccine program for COVID alongside flu for the most vulnerable. I don't think it will be all ages. What we're seeing from the immunology is that younger adults, once they're vaccinated, maintain pretty good broad spectrum response. But older adults and those with impaired immune systems are not so good. So I suspect we'll have an annual COVID jab for vulnerable groups, possibly for up to 2 years. Whether it becomes a permanent thing depends a bit on what happens to COVID. And there is some really promising research about an all coronavirus vaccine, which is something that's been in development now for over a decade, since we had SARS and MERS. They've been working on this, both the variants of the coronavirus as well. If that comes off it's in its final stages of research trials, then it may well be we move to a coronavirus vaccine, and that becomes part of the overall vaccination schedule. But I would expect by July, August, we'll have a sense of what the autumn plan will be.
Really, I mean, the numbers you just gave really illustrate the successful vaccine has been, and really emphasizing the importance of people getting it. So thank you. So any other questions about that? If not, we shall move on to, I think it's Karen, vaccination updates. So, more vaccination.
Yeah, I won't go into detail as you just discussed it. There's probably a few things to highlight around the programme. As Justin said, in line with the national offer, we're still seeing people coming in for their first dose. So that people are coming when they want to come along, and we're trying to make the offer as flexible as possible. So there's been an audit, I think, around all of the ways in which we're delivering vaccination, particularly looking at inequalities in those hard to reach groups. So now I won't go through all of the areas. It's using housing versus homeless, a rotating model around maternity providers. So we're trying to be as bespoke as possible, using every opportunity. In line, actually, we have seen a drop off in the booster, but it was a fantastic effort over the Christmas period by all providers, I think, to deliver that booster programme. But as I said, it's still going to be something that we're continuing to work through. In terms of flu, we shouldn't forget we still have to offer and deliver the flu vaccine, so that uptake is a lot lower. But obviously, as Justin said, we need to work through those. And we've just appointed as a system a new interim director of vaccination. This is becoming more business as usual. We put this programme together at speed and pace, using an awful lot of staff we've deployed. So we need to look at how we develop it going forward as a clear programme. So a lady called Kate Wooley, who's worked in Solihull, has been appointed as our interim director of vaccination. So still a huge amount more work to do, but those are the highlights.
Thank you. I'm really interested in the director of vaccination now, because actually some of the lessons learned from vaccination, I think, translate so well don't want to include some of the childhood things and the inequalities issues around that. So.
And recognising considerable effort and more agency is on directed reform, but unbelievable to get from the standard start. So just a part of that.
Many thanks to more actually, a huge amount of work and the team to do that. And hearing the impact of it as well. So fantastic and really good to still hear we're still getting some first doses.
We are.
Which is really awesome. Really so any questions on the vaccination? No? Everyone happy with that? Okay, so back to Justin now around the Commonwealth Games. I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah, so I thought I'd actually just try and share a presentation, if that's okay. And apologies for tabling this today, because I know I'm not supposed to. But I thought I was trying to think how to explain to the board the breadth of what's going on, and I thought the easiest way is to put it into a slide deck, which hopefully will appear on the screen shortly. So Commonwealth Games is now approaching fast, and we'll start to see the activation across the city and across the wider region, both as the cultural programme starts to launch, but also we're just about to close nominations for the Queen's Baton Relay, and there are opportunities for people to volunteer to be part of the opening ceremony. I think I saw something today, call for people to audition to be announcers for the Commonwealth Games as well. So if you're a budding commentator on sport, there's a brilliant opportunity to take part. So there's all sorts of stuff that I think is actually really starting to make people excited about the Commonwealth Games. And it is important to remember that this will be the largest international event that the UK will host, coming through both the pandemic and also after Brexit. So it is a really important global statement of the UK's leadership in this space. In terms of our approach from a public health perspective, there are three key elements to this. So we have a work which is focused on games preparation, and that's around creating the games environment. So that's a healthy environment in which people can enjoy the games in a smoke-free way. So that we're working with the Games Committee on ensuring there is access to drinking water and a responsible and proportionate approach to alcohol across the venues as well. We're also working with them on making sure that the food offer is healthy and celebrates the regional food and the cultural food of Birmingham in the wider West Midlands as part of this. There is, of course, a health protection element. So there is work that UKHSA have led on around risk assessments of all sites that my team have been working with them on around conceptualising what could happen, what could go wrong. It's one of the somewhat fun bits of public health if you're risk-minded in terms of the old board game of risk of playing what would happen if this occurred. And we are in the process of working through a series of infectious disease scenarios based on previous games experiences to understand what that would mean in the context of the interface between the regional UKHSA and local government team. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. We have also been working through ethical sponsorship. It has proved more complex than I think we had hoped at the start. And I think there's a lot of valuable learning, but I don't think we're going to get to a shared statement across partners in the way we perhaps had hoped. But there has been a huge amount of valuable learning through that. We're also doing work in games preparation about workforce and volunteers, particularly around health literacy and around mental health awareness. So there are two specific work strands I'll touch on briefly. During games time, we pivot into a very much a health protection response. So I'm in the process of securing a memorandum of understanding between the Council and the UKHSA, and we have retained our COVID response function until the end of September to provide surge cover for the Commonwealth Games. So my team are now going through joint training with UKHSA so that if something happens, we are able to step in and support both the response in Birmingham, but also the regional response, because many other areas have had to stand down their COVID response because the funding has ceased. And then in terms of legacy, these are stranded under 4 strands around active lifestyles, healthy eating, mental health, and Commonwealth communities. And I'll touch briefly on this in a little more detail about where we're going, progress update. So I said around the Games preparation, we've done a lot of the groundwork with the organising committee. We have been doing for some time in this space, and OP, the Office for Health, Inequalities and Disparities, have led a lot of that work from their regional team. And we've been meeting from the Council Public Health team with the Food and Waste Lead around really trying to support the food and drink environment to be as healthy and sustainable as possible. There is some innovation which I think we should probably bring back to a future board around health literacy. It's a really exciting project where we've really benefited from a public health registrar who is a joint trainee between ourselves and the University of Birmingham and has brought real academic rigour to my concept of can we make all volunteers health literate. And he's kind of got a whole framework and an evidence base around it, and evaluation framework, which I think is really exciting. And we're in the process of piloting the health literacy training programme with the COVID champions. That will then roll out across the volunteers working in the Games. And then the plan is to work with PCBS and other voluntary sector partners to offer that training programme out across wider communities. And part of what we're doing in this journey is making sure it's culturally competent and accessible, which is a really important, I think, part of our learning and reflection from COVID about we need to do a lot more in our communities to support health literacy. During Gamestown, I've talked about the surge response. As I said, that is around preparing for the worst. We're not, we're hoping that it won't happen, but I would prefer that we are prepared and we are resilient and that we have adequate specialist public health and environmental health support to manage any eventuality so that we can protect our city and we can be responsible hosts for what I hope will be a fabulous international event. Moving on to the legacy streams, which I think are the areas in which the board may be most interested. The first strand is around active lifestyles. We launched the Taylor Time campaign over the summer, which was a campaign that was co-designed with African and Caribbean and South Asian communities in Birmingham to promote physical activity. The language of Taylor is about quality family time. That's why the word was chosen. And over the early autumn, we've been kind of soft testing it. It's supported by the Bloomberg Global Cities Partnership, who require us to do a particular strand around road safety. And that will be the next phase of the Taylor Time campaign, which will launch in the late spring. We are in the process of commissioning a partner to develop culturally competent guidelines on physical activity. This is a piece of work that is actually supported by the World Health Organization, who think we are incredibly innovative in looking at this and recognise that saying do 150 minutes of moderate physical activity a week does not land very well with most communities. Most of us around the table, I think, would struggle to be able to define what is moderate physical activity, let alone be able to count up 150 minutes in a way that was coherent. So we're looking at how we can build on the learning we, again, from COVID, we did with Aston University on culturally competent translation, to look at that in the context of the CMO guidelines. The WHO are looking at this work to then build on it and take it into the World Cup in Qatar. So we're focusing on Commonwealth countries. Through their extension, they will be building on it to focus on Arab nations and Arab languages, which I think between us will give us an amazing array and an amazing legacy for the Games to be shared with Commonwealth countries. The third strand, which I think we may have mentioned at a previous board, is an ambition that over the next, over this year, financial year, we will train 1,000 healthcare professionals to give brief advice on physical activity. That builds on an existing model that was launched by Public Health England back in 2016 on moving healthcare professionals, and we've been negotiating with OHID and Sport England to bring all of those assets to bear in Birmingham over the Commonwealth Games year. We're starting with a focus on cardiovascular disease pathways and embedding it into those pathways. And alongside this, there is also a training offer to physical activity providers and community and voluntary sector organisations working with those communities. So we're really trying to ensure that across the system, people are able to have very brief conversations, 20 to 30 seconds, to nudge people in the right direction towards physical activity. The second strand is on healthy eating, similar approach around culturally competent guidelines. The Eat Well plate is very much designed on a white British diet. Although we've been working with some of the national team to improve the national resources, there's still a recognition this is a gap. So a similar kind of model of co-production around this. We have commissioned a SME food business conference, which is being planned at the moment. And part of that will be working with Commonwealth food businesses on a healthy and sustainable food offer. And that will link to the food strategy, which will be launching for public consultation, hopefully through the March Cabinet. And then the last part is around local place-based healthy eating strategies. That connects to some of the regeneration programs that are going on. The final two strands around legacy, around mental health, that's being led by the OHID regional team. And there's work going on around reformatting their psychological first aid e-learning program to roll out through the Commonwealth Games workforce. And the plan is to launch that shortly. And then the second is to refresh the Every Mind Matters campaign through a Commonwealth Games lens. So that will be launching again as we run up to Games. And then the final strand is around Commonwealth community inequalities. We are a global city in Birmingham, yet we don't actually do a lot to look at inequalities that affect particular communities within the city. And building on the learning that we had from the Bangladeshi profile and the Sikh profile, we accelerated our work plan and commissioned out an additional suite of profiles linked to Commonwealth countries. And they should launch around Easter. Alongside that, we've been testing with our NHS partners some new approaches to culturally competent services. So within the maternity services, building on the work of the Black Year Review, looking at African and Caribbean health inequalities, there's a new training programme of culturally competent maternity care that is being launched through the LMS. And we, through funding we had from national government, are piloting some culturally competent weight management programmes, starting with our African and Caribbean community, our South Asian community, and we've also been able to commission one for our learning disabled community and our Polish and Eastern European community as well. So I've included in the slide pack, which I will send through to our Secretariat to upload later today, but just to remind you an example of the Bangladeshi profile so that you have it to hand as well. But hopefully that gives an overview of what we're doing. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So I think that's a brilliant overview. Thank you, Justin. Really nice to see that it goes beyond just giving that and sporting with the breadth of what's being offered in food, giving people confidence and confidence now. Is amazing and actually really playing on the strengths of Birmingham as a very good city in a culturally diverse city. I'm really trying to build on that, so thank you very much. So has anyone got any questions for Justin about the Commonwealth Games and the legacy? It's huge potential.
I just say that's a fantastic presentation, and the University of Birmingham and partners for the Games, we're just absolutely delighted. And it's fantastic because the collaborative opportunities we're getting from universities around the world. We're really excited about passing the it's generating new discussions between students and academics. And yeah, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to put on the landscape in a positive way. So yeah, City Council have been really great leaders in terms of taking that forward. So just commend the report and commend the work, really.
I can commend it. I mean, from an NHS point of view, years we've been saying that we need to prevent people from getting ill, because that's what we need. We can't learn in the same way. If you keep people active, if you keep people eating healthy foods, if you really try and tackle the causes of things like mental health, which includes activity of food, you reduce the burden on the NHS and actually make people happier and healthier, and actually everything sort of fits together. So I think there's a lot to commend.
Just, I mean, local NHS organisations doing everything to kind of celebrate the Games, and when we go with workforce from different Commonwealth countries, etc. Is there any kind of local celebration of NHS links with Commonwealth countries?
I mean, I think
I think there are some. I'm not sure, Mark, whether we can come out of COVID yet to talk
Well,
about
there's still time.
You know, I think it's a really,
Still time.
I'll ask
really
Mark,
good.
but I don't think I know of anything yet.
We could, well, I mean, because it's genuinely, you know, it's.
Yeah, no, I'm great.
It's a genuinely good question. I think it's so head down and very, being all shot.
Yeah.
But actually, I think having to go well would be very, very much help. Much more involved in this, and actually, we probably should be. And I think it's a good challenge.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll be with you here next time then.
Yes.
Okay, that's all bad.
Thank you. Okay, so. Sorry, I'm
Sorry.
Okay.
It was just around some of the kind of encouraging health choices stuff, thinking about the wider determinants of health. Is there a dimension included there around actually affordability of making some of those health choices as well?
Yeah, so not with, I suppose, yes, but not within the Commonwealth Games legacy. So the food strategy, which is coming to Cabinet Council to get approval, public consultation. I think many colleagues have been involved in the kind of pre-consultation engagement, and we heard really loudly that point about affordability. So we've actually added in a 9th work stream to the strategy now on food security, which is specifically around food poverty, so that we are absolutely clear that is a priority and has a dedicated work stream. But as you know, the challenge of how we address food poverty is about really looking at the system of the city. How do we change what's being sold, how it's being sold, as well as what we can do to influence national policy and welfare and the amount of money that goes into people's pockets. So I think that I hope when you see it, you will see that we are trying to get past the sticking plaster of food banks and really start to get into how do we create a city which is truly affordable and celebrates the culture that we have in this global setting.
Just on that theme of partnership, just to wonder around schools education as well as to presume that's a priority for yourselves.
Yeah, to some extent, I mean, I presented what the public health legacy is. There is a separate work stream on education and skills, both for adults and for schools, which we input into, but it's a light input at the moment, to be honest. And some of that's around, as Robin alluded to, the Games is run as a partnership. Different partners are leading on different bits, and we don't lead on that particular bit. So, but I think it is something we can request through the Secretariat and get a written update from the education and skills and what's happening now.
Because I was particularly thinking about just education in schools as well. It seems to have less priority nowadays than when I was doing it.
Sure, so about PE and yeah. So one of the things that we started doing, I think you remember, you might not have been here, Mike, when Sue Harrison came to a previous board and she just started, Sue talked about her ambition as the new Director of Children's Services to take a different look at how we were creating healthy schools. And that builds on some of the good practice from West Birmingham, where there's some really interesting examples of GPs working with local schools in PCN systems to help working together with the wider public health system. I think, you know, and I will plead on COVID on this one, that it hasn't moved as fast as I would like, but it is definitely on the agenda as something we want to move forward. Where we have moved it forward faster is we secured money on mental health prevention from the Department of Health, and we were able in East Birmingham to commission that Birmingham Education Partnership to work with, and I won't remember the exact number, a set of primary schools to create a mentally healthy school environment. And that has been really, really successful. One of the challenges it is also quite expensive, so we can't afford at the moment to scale it across the whole city. But my hope is we are able to do it kind of step-by-step way, because it's not just about curriculum time, it's about the environment of the school, the culture, the physical environment, the social environment, and creating an approach in which health and wellbeing is embedded across the entire school, in the same way we try to embed health and wellbeing across the entire health and social care system.
And so I think that's a really good summary of what's going on. I think there was an action out of that that helps to go away at how we're going to celebrate some of these efforts. Thank you, Justin. Okay, now next item, I think Karen's going to say.
Yes,
Anna's had to
apologies, Anna's had to leave, so, and apologies also from David Melville, who was going to give the presentation. So I hope the board will bear with me, so I shall do both presentations and pick up the highlights. So what I'll try and cover is a little bit of more detail around the Ics timeline and the transition. And where Anna was going to focus a little bit more was about what's happening at place. It may be that we return to the next meeting with more detail around those, but perhaps raise some of the questions to think about. So integrated care boards are the organisation that will come into force with the necessary national legislation. It was going to be April. That has now been deferred to July 2022. That's a national decision, and that was announced back in December. So what that means in practice is that the CCG will still have to remain an organisation statutorily taking decisions, but I think where we want to is to work shadow form and to really continue on with the development of the ICS and the RCB. And that's really about pushing ahead with the future direction and the integration of services for citizens and locations. So that longer period, in some aspects, is welcome to give us that opportunity post this Omicron wave to effectively identify those key milestones. So just a little bit about where we're at. I think the recruitment to the Chief Executive Officer, if you remember, was not successful, but we do now have David Melville as the interim designate Chief Executive. So we are not halting or stopping any of that. There are adverts out at the moment for the executive team, and that went out on Friday for the board posts, and we're appointed to some non-executive posts as well. So the infrastructure really around the organisation is continuing at pace. Probably of interest to the board is the model in which we're going to operate. And there are two key boards, I think, that are going to be established in shadow for medical. One of them is the Integrated Care Board, which is the more statutory organisations across health making the decisions. But I think the overall strategy and partnership working across all of health and local authority and voluntary sector, the sectors, will be called the Integrated Partnership Board. And at the moment, the composition of that Integrated Care Partnership Board is subject to a wide-ranging discussion with partners to gauge the views on how we set that up. The ICP owns the strategy, and we want to bring in that level of focus around inequalities, the culture, and that range of voices. So it is not yet identified and agreed in terms of that membership, but I know that there's work going on to work through that in more detail, and some of you across the board may well be involved in that. It's likely to have involvement of the Health and Wellbeing Board Chair and the Cabinet Lead, as well as the providers and voluntary sector and other members. So that's the sort of level of involvement that will be in the partnership. And I think the emphasis is not to have too unwieldy a group, but to try and make it manageable. And I think the link with the Health and Wellbeing Board is going to be absolutely key as well. For the ICB, that's the organisations board, sorry about the acronyms, but obviously there will be critical involvement of local authorities and providers and partner members in that group. and that is at a final proposal stage. And as I said, I think that's going into shadow form. So the final design, I think, is going to be launched and agreed by 1st of April. And obviously, we're going to have to be flexible about how we work and manage this transition through. I think, as we've heard earlier from Colette, we want to work differently. I can say it that way. It's not CCG Mark 2. We don't want to have that. We want to do things differently. And working closely with all parties, it is about subsidiarity and ensuring that decisions happen locally at base or as locally as possible. Clinically and professionally led where appropriate, and a lot around inequalities and transformation. So what has been developed and is about to be signed off is what's called an inception plan. And it's really about setting out the key priorities of the board and the ICS going forward. Clearly, the immediate priorities are going to be related to Omicron and the effects of recovery. But it is about those longer-term priorities to make that difference to the people's lives and the long-term priorities. And that's where the ICP will develop a 10-year master plan. That's really where we want to get to quite quickly. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour, I think, about where we're at. So in summary, it's about going to shadow form, getting the executive team in place, and really getting those partners involved in those things to get going for the next stage of the development. So that was the first sort of pause, I think, if there were any questions on the development. And then I'll go through Anna's presentation a little bit more about PACE and what that means for PACE. So I'll just take a quick pause there to see if there are any questions.
So, thanks, Karen. I think really helpful. Be useful to understand at the ICB level where system voice will carry. So I think we've got a stronger understanding at the place level, but obviously the ICS is like a super job thing. So is there a merger to think about kind of how that's going to be made meaningful?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that we recognise probably at places where the strength is around engagement with communities and tapping into the resources through the local authority is going to be key. Those local communities, local partners, whether that be police or GPs. So I don't think we want to construct something on top of that that's going to duplicate. But certainly in terms of membership on the ICP, that's been discussed. Obviously, I'm sure with Health Watch as well, and the partners, how we embed that into the ICP. And I think that the organisation, the ICP, will take that view from the ICP and other stakeholders. So it's really utilising and developing what we have, the strengths of where we've learned from vaccinations, for example, how we communicate with communities, and tapping into and supporting and developing what we have rather than a big beast organisation at the top that's trying to develop its own communication infrastructure. But it's work in progress and definitely one I think that we want more to do.
For me, I think partnership working through local authorities. The strength of local authorities in the system voices heard, something we really translated the ICP and help.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so it's a big focus for the board here is social determinants of health, that we created with housing, exercise, etc. So will that kind of work get incorporated within the ICP, or will it be done not in parallel? That's not joined up, but will the local authority be more responsible for that aspect, and the ICP will be more responsible for delivery? How does that? Yeah, I'm quite in my head right.
Yeah, I think it does take a bit of working through. So the ICP is the group that will be the most important point to set up the overall strategy.
That's the
broad church strategy. So whether that's around determinants of health, housing, etc. So the membership of that really will be from local authorities, Health Watch, community lay members. So they're setting the overall framework for the delivery across all partners. So that clearly will involve the expertise and understanding of the population health management, links with the community. So really getting a rich, diverse view of what they call the master plan will be about, and using that information. So we know every organisation can't be represented, but we're really trying to get that connection in, and the health and wellbeing board is going to be a key part of that. The delivery of that, so whether it's around wider determinants of health, would happen at different levels. So if there was something that was key to about the Commonwealth Games, active lifestyle, that could be delegated to the board at base. This comes from where's the best approach. If it's a consistent policy around early years or maternity, it could be that it's decided it's better done across Birmingham and Suffolk. So I think where some of this will be delegated to depends on what makes sense. And it's that subsidiarity, so where's the best place to make those decisions safely? Clearly, where it's linked to housing and social care on the local community, we would want a lot to go and be delegated to place. So I think that's going to be the key once the master plan is set, right? How do you delegate it to the right level?
It's just worth adding on that. So there is an ICS Inequalities board, and there's an ICS Prevention board, and the ICS Inequalities board, both myself and Green Lieutenant, the DPH Solihull sit on, and that's exactly the kind of wrestling as Karen has described that we're doing, because there's no point replicating the health and wellbeing board, which has a statutory footing, and the right partners around the room. But what we're also doing is looking at some of those challenges through the prism of the NHS as an employer, the NHS as an economic power. So a lot of the work that Salma is leading on anchor networks, and think how do we take some of the great learning from UHBT that's been anchored for a while, working with Claire's and go, how do we take that learning and apply it to a GP practice or to a PCN and really working that through. The prevention board is much more focused on the commitments made through the long-term plan. So where there are a series of the NHS must do things as part of the 10-year plan, the prevention board is taking that kind of programme management place. But we're still working through all of that. I chair within all of these bundles, the population health management bit. So I'm kind of responsible for the insight, intelligence, thinking that's driving all of that, and Ruth chairs the prevention board. So we're slowly divvying it all up between each other and trying to avoid replication and everyone sitting in the same room interviewing.
I suppose from my point of view, I'm normally quite a practical soul, so I think when you start to see a practical way of working or an issue or a particular programme and understand how it might work, I think it comes to life. So if you use going to be something I think will work and learn together, and my mantra is if it's not simple and adding value and improving health-wise or health-wise, why do it. So I think we're going to have to learn together around this.
Sorry, well, yeah, my question was kind of following on from that, really, because just from my perspective, looking at this, it does look rather complex and potentially very bureaucratic. You've got an ICP, you've got the Health and Wellbeing Board, the ICP, you've got a place-based committee, and then 5 local systems. I think that's got the potential to be incredibly bureaucratic and messy. I have to say, I know we've got no control over it, but if you're starting from scratch, I'm not entirely sure why you need to have a wellbeing board and an ICP as separate organisations. So it's kind of, I think it's just in there because we've got it already, isn't it? But how are we going to prevent this from becoming overly bureaucratic?
That's a really good question, and I think if you take away the governance, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to get partners to work close together and to integrate services in a better way. So I think it's going to be a lot about how we work together as partners and use the best way of navigating the governance in the lowest possible level. So I see the place board and the health and wellbeing board being absolutely critical, and that delegation of place is going to be critical. So I think from that level down, I think there's some real opportunities to have, for once, the resources, the delegation of what we want to do, but not giving you the scripted way of doing it, which is probably what we've done in the past. I think the bit above is around assurance to a large degree, and I think we've learned how not to do it, and we learned how to do it properly, and that's going to be up to us to make that as simple as possible. As I said, I think we are all trying to make it as understandable, but for the citizen and the population, they don't see this. We need to just understand what our priorities are. If we pick those priorities, whether it's vaccinations, maternity, or perinatal, I think we've got to learn by doing some of these examples. But as you say, some of them are statutory. The ICP and the ICB are always have to have. I think it's how we can make them as best as we possibly can to be flexible in these departments.
As I have more input.
I mean, it's worth saying we did do quite a lot of wrestling with could we make the place board and the health and wellbeing board the same, both in Birmingham and in Solihull. And I think where we've got to is that in this initial first couple of years, the place board is going to be very focused on the delivery of NHS transformation more than the strategic discussions about things like the food environment, etc. So at this point, we did quite a lot of work with colleagues like Errol, going through and going, could we have a whole day meeting and do, because a lot of it would say people and do place and then health and wellbeing board, and we got to a position, I think, where we all agreed that that was, one, not very good for our health and wellbeing to spend 12 hours locked in a room with each other, but also actually that it was becoming clearer that the place board was around operational delivery, driving operational transformation at place, and that in this first couple of years, the ICB and ICP will be where the kind of strategic system thinking is, and therefore trying to merge it just wasn't practical. And Solihull independently, it came to the same conclusion. Talking to my colleagues nationally, everyone's got to the same place, that in the first 2 years, they need to stay separate, but that's not a forever decision. And I think that's what's been really impressive. And I think, again, comparing to my colleagues nationally, is here we've had really grown-up conversations about what could we do, can we make it work, because there are national things you've got to jump through. In other areas, it has not been quite as positive, shall we say. So I think we've come to a kind of sensible, this is how we navigate the years of transition. I think the other thing we shouldn't forget that's really seismic of this is West Birmingham. So we will, for the first time, have a Birmingham place with one set of meetings for Birmingham, and that's a really important, big, powerful step forward. But part of that is the locality structure. So recognising that West Birmingham as the locality has actually worked quite well navigating the Black Country and West Birmingham CCG, in creating their footprint, their identity, and being able to move that forward. So there's also, I think, been some really good, what can we learn from West Birmingham about how really to deliver a place, because we haven't really got that in the rest of Birmingham yet, have we, other than Solihull operates well as a place. So I think there are some real benefits.
Well, we're going on into the next part of the presentation.
Yeah, given I'm going to just pick this up, so apologies, Chair, and apologies. I think, yeah, so it's an emergency at home, but I think what Anna would want to do is circulate around some key areas and some questions really to take away. I think we've touched on those. I think it's under development, so there's still some opportunities, I think, to get your views, particularly about that place committee link with this board. If there's any comments or suggestions, I think that would be really helpful. And given the work to date, how do the priorities of this board previously work into those localities and those forums going forward? So I think there's some opportunities still to engage in that. I think the next steps are really to refine the functions and the opportunities to delegate out of those and what would be retained. And as we've heard from Paul Lampy, our Chief Finance Officer, how does the money work? I think those opportunities to develop the money are going to be really important. There's also some work around how the Inequalities in Birmingham get established. West is obviously much more developed, but I think we're really keen to do that. And also at a really low level, and GPs and care workers, social workers, really meet together on the ground, a real practical delivery that we can start now. So I think rather than go through all of that as presentation, I think it's some questions to take away and for Anna to think better.
And there are some more detailed slides.
They are.
And how it works today. So I know we've started lots of questions cases. So we'll get more what's the things that I'm sure we can get out of back to the internet to do some more detail. But as Karen says, it's a work in progress. So it's not done deal, and there's still lots to do. And just as I said, probably ongoing for the next couple of years.
Yes.
Any more questions or queries or? So I'm sorry, I had to. Sorry.
I've seen the interim ICT. I've heard the presentation that Donna has presented last week. Very interesting. Because BCSC is really committed to the development.
Sorry, you have to really shout.
Sorry.
There's a heater behind us, which is really drowning you out. Sorry.
Sorry. Did I? Is this better?
That's better.
Okay. I'm Seema Vigivara, I'm the interim ICS HP lead, but today I've come in to in place of Richard, who's asked me to join me. So I heard the presentation from Anna at the last week. It was very interesting, the involvement. I just wanted to share that the presentation was presented. It was interesting despite having the pressures from within the COVID and other, there was a lot of representation from wide stakeholders in the workshop that Anna had taken on. So one thing that came to my mind was there any representation from local communities? And I wasn't sure, I didn't get that opportunity. So one of the questions I have is to look at if there was involvement from the local communities in the workshop engagement.
It's a question I'll have to take away, to be honest, because Anna's leading on this, but we can certainly get that response around.
And just a comment was really interesting. Each place had their priorities. So from the workshop team, that it was clearly, you could see that every place within that had their priorities clear, what they want to achieve. So I just wanted to pass on that to her.
That's helpful. And I'm sure if Anna was here, she would want to reassure and engage with local communities, but we'll ask that question. That's okay.
Thank you. Okay, so shall we move on to the next item, which is going to be the BSOL recovery plan, and I presume someone's online to Harvey is here. Brilliant. Harvey, do you want to make a start?
Yes, of course, thank you. I've also got my colleague Ian Shaw on the call as well. He's on camera now, and Ian's the elective recovery clinical lead for BSOL. So I'll take you through the paper briefly, and both Ian and I can take questions at the end. So thank you for your time today. We wanted to meet with you as part of our regular engagement that we've been carrying out with stakeholders over the past couple of years of COVID. There's 4 specific areas that we wanted to update you on. Firstly is the latest impact of Omicron on our services and the system. We'll also take you through our surge plan and which aspects that we've enacted of that plan. The work that we've been doing on our multi-year system recovery plan, and also planning priorities going forward, because we've now had the national planning guidance from NHS England and improvement. So there's some information in your pack which sets out some measures that we routinely look at on a daily basis in relation to COVID, and it's a little bit out of date because of the timing for producing the report. But what we've seen is we saw a peak in the numbers of patients in hospital at UHB with COVID, and we also specifically monitor the number of patients that are in ITU, because we use that as an indicator of pressure within the system. Since the report was produced, we've seen those numbers come down. So as of yesterday, we had 349 COVID inpatients across the sites at UHB, and we have 12 patients in ITU. So that number has come down quite significantly. I think the other thing I just wanted to add, though, is that despite those numbers reducing, the system is still under pressure, especially on the emergency side. So we are seeing patients who are in hospital for other conditions and illnesses who happen to have COVID, so are being treated outside of ITU, but they're being treated for their main condition as opposed to COVID specifically. But we are seeing general pressure across the system. In terms of the surge plan, so this is something that we've had in place from the outset, really, from 2 years ago. And what this does, it just mirrors the actions that we as a system and as a set of system partners take in response to surge, and making sure we're in a state of preparedness when a surge does take place. A key part of this is our governance around what we call a daily gold call, which is made up of chief execs across our health and local authority partners. So we've got representation from across the system in that meeting, and that's where decisions are being made around our services, how we manage pressures, and if there's any specific service changes that we need to make, or workforce realignment that we have to carry out in terms of offering mutual aid to each other and managing those pressures. So the surge plan has a number of phases within it, which depends on which stage we're at with the COVID impact and overall general pressures on our services. And each stage has a set of surge steps that we've worked together to produce, which mainly involves opening up additional capacity or repurposing capacity to be able to create in this phase. You just get a bit of feedback there, sorry. So this has really helped us prepare in the event of a super surge happening. So we've planned up to the sort of most extreme situation in terms of surge. We've managed to stay in at level phase 1 throughout the majority of the past few weeks. We've had aspects of phase 2 that we've implemented. And the other thing to say that we've also carried out a quality and equality impact analysis on our surge plan. So we maintain that sight on quality of services for our patients as well. So as I mentioned, the partners across the system have provided mutual aid in response to the COVID impact, and that's been absolutely critical in our ability to respond to those pressures as a BSOL system. And we've also tried really hard to maintain service delivery as far as possible. You'll remember there was a national diktat to stand down elective services when we were at the absolute peak of COVID. We haven't been caught in that position this time, so we've tried to maintain as much of elective as possible. And the crucial element of this surge plan is maintaining a focus on staff health and wellbeing. So we've really applied learning from the previous waves onto the way we've managed this surge going forward. So as part of this surge plan, we implemented a set of temporary service changes across the system, and there's a slide within the pack that sets out what those are. That's made up of diverts being put into place, services being moved to another site temporarily along with that workforce, and also creating additional capacity. At this stage, we've reverted back on those temporary service changes. On the whole, there's probably just one or two things that remain in place. But we continue to closely monitor the situation, because if we do end up in a surge situation again, we need to be able to act quickly and stand some of those service changes back up again to be able to manage those pressures. Moving on to the multi-year recovery plan. So there's a lot of work that the system has done. Obviously, you're hearing that feedback as well, and hopefully you can hear me properly. So in relation to the multi-year restoration and recovery plan, so a lot of work was done on this prior to Christmas. Obviously, then Omicron happened, but this plan is effectively about putting our system on a sustainable footing over a longer period of time, and making sure that we're clearly describing and enacting how we're increasing capacity, managing our demand, reducing waiting times and the backlog, and really streamlining access for our patients to the urgent and emergency care services. So within that plan, we'll be setting out and have set out capital and revenue requirements along with efficiency and productivity requirements, and obviously what our profile is going forward and our trajectories around workforce as well. So we're in the process of finalising that plan and hopefully taking it through our governance soon as well. Then I just wanted to move on to the national planning priorities. As I mentioned, the national planning guidance landed on Christmas Eve. Obviously, we're in the middle of dealing with Omicron at the stage, so we waited a few weeks until we started our planning round, which we're in the middle of now. But we've set out what those national planning priorities are within the pack, and they very much mirror our local system priorities that we've set ourselves. So we're now working with partners across health and care to develop our plans going forward, and we're using the vehicle of shadow care programmes to develop those plans as a way of building on the good work that we've done over the past year or two around working in a care programme model. So there's a submission requirement that goes to NHS England. There's a draft and a final. However, this is very much a local plan for our BSOL population that also happens to meet the needs of the national planning guidance as well. So just to summarise, I think it's fair to say we're probably not completely out of the woods as far as COVID is concerned. There's still a bit of an impact there, and we'll continue to monitor that position. And our priority remains responding to the needs of our population and looking after our staff as our biggest asset as well. In terms of those temporary service changes, obviously we'll review those in light of what the forward plan looks like, and we'll engage with our stakeholders and make sure that we're following due process as we take any proposals forward around any permanent service changes. As mentioned, we'll be finalising the multi-year plan and then obviously completing that work on the plan for 22-23 as well. So I'll pause there, but Ian and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm sorry, this is some feedback going. We can hear you very well this end.
Okay, the sound's not great this end, so we'll try our best.
No problem. So any questions for Harvey on the research panel and the issues that have been going on? She just presented.
Just one question, Harvey, about, and I might have missed it because I step out briefly, about how in our approach we're considering inequalities. And I know nationally there have been concerns in addressing waiting lists that's exacerbated some of the inequalities because the most deprived or those that don't speak English as a first language haven't been able to respond quickly enough to the NHS letters, etc. So have we got some active strands of work thinking about how we make sure we're addressing inequality proactively with managing the backlog?
Yeah, Ian's really close to this work from a sort of clinical perspective. So if Ian, you want to take that question, and I can add anything if needed.
Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm in a hotel in Leeds. It's work related, obviously. I think, I mean, it's something that is absolutely at the front of the thinking that we're doing, both in terms of the backlog recovery and also of the sort of wider the investment planning that we're trying to make with regard to capital for next year. And it's now, I think it's fair to say that meaningful assessment of inequalities within our system and the impact of whatever steps we might take is built into that planning guidance now. So I think it was probably not deliberate, but previously we kind of maybe knew about inequalities as being an issue, but didn't really have to address it operationally, whereas now it's built into the operational decision making much more effectively, and I think that helps. We have some data, but I would say there is still quite a way to go in terms of building more meaningful data sets around all the various aspects of inequality that we see across the Sorry, hopefully that's not me, but so it is in our thinking. It is close to the front of our planning and our decision making about what we do next. But as all of the members of the group will know, there is a significant amount of work to do on it. So I think that's probably an honest answer. Javier, you may want to add something more to that.
No, I'd echo what Ian said. I think, as you say, I think that national drive that focus on inequalities has helped sort of focus people's minds as well, and having it built into everything that we do. So inequalities, as we had in the long-term plan, as we've had in plans since, it's a much stronger thread through our planning going forward. And we people like me, Ian, and others are constantly banging the drum around having that at the forefront of everybody's minds and having it built through everything that we do, including our planning.
Thank you both. If there's anyone else got any questions or think items they want to raise with Harvey and Ian, we go. Thank you very much, Harvey and Ian. And thanks for coming in and coming all the way from Leeds in.
Thank you. Bye.
So I think everyone's happy to take that as it's there for no for you. Your choose. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think we've got a few items on the agenda just here as Rachel received around sexual health strategy, end of life e-learning.
Yeah, can I just flag share a couple of points from the noted items for colleagues to be aware of. So first of all, in terms of the sexual health strategy, that's the note that's now moving forward into its consultation phase, and that will go to the March Cabinet for public consultation. So I think we would welcome any feedback from the board through the secretariat, particularly through Shiraz, on if there are engagement opportunities during the consultation period to inform that. This strategy is really important because it underpins the recommissioning of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Service, which will commence going into the autumn. So really commend that to the board. The second is the deep dive needs assessment on end of life. This has been a long time coming, and apologies for that, but COVID did get in the way, unfortunately. But I'm really pleased that this is now finally published. And two things I want to highlight to the board. One is the powerful voices of citizens and professionals that come through the report. It is a really powerful read when you listen to what people are saying about their experiences of how we support them about end of life. And the report sets out some really clear opportunities for action, which I think are already being taken forward through the movement to become a compassionate city that public health and adult social care are collaborating on with NHS colleagues and BCS and Barclay as well. So I think there's a really tangible way to take forward these recommendations. But I do recommend that members of the board do read it. For the Health Protection Forum, this is our annual report. I think, as you will understand, COVID did slightly get in the way of other forms of health protection during the year, but I would ask board members to take some time over next week and just read it, because it does reiterate that while COVID has been happening, there are lots of other things that have still challenged the city. We've had some really complicated TB cases where we've worked in partnership to support citizens to receive treatment and care and find solutions that work for them, and they've been going on while we've been tackling COVID at the same time. We continue to face real challenges in immunisation and with screening, and we are working with national colleagues and local and regional colleagues about how we take the learning from COVID and apply it to try and address some of these inequalities. So just highlight that forward. The final thing that I would define two things I mentioned. One is for the March board, we'll bring in the final Black Year report. That entered its journey through committees to get to us as of yesterday. So I'm really excited that we have finalised. There are 39 opportunities for action set out in the Black Year review. Community partners and academic partners went through them over the weekend for us and really reiterated how important it is that the breadth of the Health and Wellbeing Board listen and take note of this report. The 2-year journey we've been on really has highlighted and identified decades of inequality and a loss of trust and confidence from our African and Caribbean communities in the public sector. And this report gives us opportunities to redress that. So I think it's really exciting that it's coming to us in March, so something to look forward to. And finally, the City of Nature report, which is there as an update, was approved by Cabinet this morning for the Council. And so we'll be moving forward into operational delivery. I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and it has been a great partnership to really embed health alongside economic growth, jobs and skills, and maximising the green assets of the city. So to say that has now been approved by Cabinet.
Thank you, Justin. So is everyone happy to receive those items and note them? And there's anyone any questions that they want to raise at this point? No, thank you. There's some really interesting things in that fact. So please be careful to make sure you do, because it's certainly a civic nature stuff. Fascinating. I'm really excited to hear more about that here. Yeah, hopefully really well. I think a lot of the items that come up are really emphasising a real sea change in how we work within Birmingham and really celebrate the Birmingham city and actually play to the strengths of that rather than create division and inequality. So I think that's come across the heart of the agenda. I think that's just in the right. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. There's a few other group information items on there as well, just so everyone's aware. And I don't think there's anything in terms of urgent other business. Brilliant. So thank you all very much for coming, and we've pretty much finished on time. Yes, first, it's pretty clear. Came to this side, so thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, good to you. Yeah, I think it's kind of settled down more.